28th of January 2021. Just after 10:30 p.m. Cardiff, a crew pulls up on Newport Road under the cover of night. The plan was quick and simple. Within minutes, doors were smashed open, believing they could strip the building and vanish into the night. But what unfolded inside was nothing like the quick hit they expected. Almost a year later, in December 2021, Tunbridge Wells. Another night raid. This time, 3 vehicles pull up quietly to a house in Cayley Road. A group of masked men move with purpose. But the deeper they push inside, the more it becomes clear. This is not the kind of raid you walk away from untouched. 2 houses, 2 raids. And in both, what began as a grab for cash turned into nights of sheer terror. This is the story of Britain's growing house raids, and how they descended into brutality and blood. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the details. On the outside, 319 Newport Road looked like any other forgotten building in Cardiff. Once a GP surgery, now transformed into far more sinister. By January 2021, what stood there now was no longer a clinic, but a factory. One of hundreds that dotted Britain's towns and cities, hidden in plain sight. Inside, the transformation was striking. Every upstairs room was filled wall to wall with cannabis plants, more than 570 in total, nurtured under bright lamps powered by an illegally diverted electricity supply. The system was crude but effective. The crop, when fully processed, carried a street value that could swing between £64,000 and £250,000, depending on its purity and distribution. 319 Newport Road was under the control of an Albanian organised crime group, part of a network that stretched across multiple addresses in the city, each one fortified and concealed to protect the investment inside. At the heart of the property was Heisland Aliaj, 25, the so-called gardener. He lived among the plants, his role simple: protect them day and night. He wasn't there for cultivation skills. He was a minder, chosen to ensure no one breached the doors without answering to those above him. And those above him were well known to police. Joseph Nushi, 26, an enforcer figure with strong links back to Lushnja, Albania. Mihal Dhana, 27, a man connected to multiple addresses across Cardiff, trusted as both organizer and protector. Mario Kato, another of the group's men, operating more in the shadows but tied closely to the network. And finally, Gledys Mahala, the youngest at just 19, a runner and support player already embroiled in the group's business before his 20s had even begun. Names that surfaced through appeals and case files also included Artan Palucci, with ties to Cathays, and Elidon Alesi, linked to East Finchley in London and later charged in relation to participation in organised criminal activity. Another name on wanted notices at the time was Ledjan Kivani, associated with Tottenham. The secrecy was designed to keep police and rivals away, but in the world of grow houses, secrecy is fragile. Word spreads, addresses leak, and sooner or later, someone decides to test the door. Thursday, 28th of January 2021. Cardiff was already deep into the winter night when a small convoy crossed in from London. 2 men had made the journey west, a burglary team heading for a specific address. Among them was Tomasz Varga, a 23-year-old from Dagenham in East London. He was no stranger to the police. His record already carried burglary offences, and by this night he had settled into a familiar rhythm. Alongside him was Carl Davies, the man who would later become one of the most important witnesses in the case. At around 10:33 p.m, Varga and Davies forced their way into the building. Entry was crude and effective, the kitchen window prized open, glass and frame giving way just enough to let them climb inside. What they found confirmed the intelligence they had received. Upstairs, row after row of cannabis plants, heat lamps burning, the air thick with the smell of the crop. The plan was simple. They had not come for confrontation. They had come for plants. Armed with cutters, they went to work stripping stalks, filling bags, moving quickly but methodically. In the drug trade, a grow house like this represented fast cash. The crop inside 319 Newport Road alone was valued at up to £120,000, a single haul worth more than most street-level robberies could ever deliver. The house had been chosen because it appeared lightly guarded, a single minder inside, no signs of heavy protection. For Wagga and Davies, the silence inside gave a false sense of control. But growing houses are never easy marks. What the raiders did not know was that alarms were being raised almost as soon as they entered. Heisland Eliage was quick to sense the intrusion. Whether from the sound of the kitchen window forced open or the disturbance upstairs, he realized almost immediately that the crop he was tasked to protect was under attack. His role was not to fight back alone, it was to raise the alarm. And that's exactly what he did. Phones lit up across Cardiff. Eliage's urgent calls went out to the men running the operation. Within minutes, the message was clear. Intruders were inside the grow house, stripping the crop. The response was rapid. Joseph Nushi and Mihal Dahana, both central figures in the network, moved fast. They climbed into a Mazda, heading directly for Newport Road. From another linked address on Column Road, a Mercedes C200 Sport pulled out into the night. Men who had been spread across different addresses converged on the target, summoned with the expectation of immediate action. Between 10:38 and 10:43 p.m., cars were dispatched from multiple parts of the city. CCTV footage later shown in court captured vehicles heading directly towards Newport Road, a flurry of movement that prosecutors would describe as a call to arms. For Nushi and Dahana, this was not about chance or uncertainty. Their crop was under threat, and their network was built to respond. Other associates followed, each one knowing that the value at stake was worth both the risk and the violence it might demand. Upstairs, Wagga and Davies were still cutting, unaware of what was coming. Their break-in had lasted barely minutes. By the time they filled their first bags, the city's underworld was already in motion, closing in on them from multiple directions. The first to feel it was Carl Davies. As the reinforcements stormed into property, the kitchen and corridors filled with chaos. Davies was cornered and struck repeatedly, with whatever came to hand. A bat, a bamboo pole, even a brick were used in the assault. The blows landed hard, leaving him injured and dazed, but in the confusion, he managed to break free. Stumbling out of the house, he slipped into the night, finding cover in nearby streets. His escape would prove vital in the case that pieced together much of what happened inside. For Thomas Wagga, there was no escape. He was caught, surrounded, and dragged into a brutal assault. Witnesses and forensic evidence later confirmed the scale of what he endured. Between 25 and 28 separate blows rained down on him. His ribs were fractured. His arms bore the marks of defensive wounds, showing how he tried desperately to shield himself. Severe head injuries revealed the ferocity of the strikes. This was not random violence. Prosecutors told the jury it was punishment, a deliberate attempt to cause grievous bodily harm rather than an immediate killing. He was to be interrogated, pressed for names of who had sent him and who else might have been behind the raid. In that moment, Wagga was no longer just a burglar. He was leveraged, a way for the Albanian crew to push back against rival gangs and protect their boss's interests. When the beating inside was over, Wagga was overpowered and forced out of the house. Blood evidence later traced the route, from the grow house to the waiting Mercedes. Bundled into the vehicle, he was taken from Newport Road under the eyes of those who had gathered to defend the crop. From Newport Road, the convoy moved quickly through Cardiff's back streets. The vehicles were tracked later on CCTV, their routes threading towards Waterloo Gardens. Inside the Mercedes, Tomasz Wagga was gravely injured. He had suffered catastrophic trauma, his body struggling under the weight of the blows he had received. He was still alive when they drove him out of the grow house, but he would not survive the journey. At around 11:30 p.m., barely an hour after the raid had begun, a member of the public made a grim discovery on Westville Road in Pennyland. Lying on the ground, Waga's body showed the marks of the violence he had endured. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing they could do. A post-mortem later confirmed the cause of death: airway obstruction caused by blood inhalation following severe head injuries. In short, the attack had left him unable to breathe, his own injuries overwhelming him. The discovery of Thomas Waga's body on Westville Road launched one of the most complex investigations South Wales police had faced in years. From the outset, detectives believed his death was not random. The brutality of the attack, its proximity to a fully functioning cannabis factory, and the sudden disappearance of vehicles all pointed to the hand of organized crime. Forensic teams began their painstaking work. The first priority was to trace the vehicles. Detectives sifted through hours of CCTV footage from the surrounding area, eventually identifying a silver-grey Mercedes C200 Sport, registration BK09RBX. That car disappeared completely. Despite nationwide appeals and even a Crime Stoppers reward for information, it has never been recovered. Police believe the Mercedes held crucial evidence: traces of Waga's blood, DNA, and possibly the very weapons used in the assault. Yet, like the men who fled abroad in the days after the killing, the vehicle slipped beyond reach. Investigators suspected it had either been burned out, hidden, or shipped overseas. Tracking the footage back towards 319 Newport Road, footage captured multiple vehicles converging on the grow house between 10:38 and 10:43 p.m., then moving swiftly towards Waterloo Gardens before the discovery of Waga's body less than an hour later. There, detectives focused on another vehicle linked to the violence, the Mazda, driven by Nushi and Jana. That car was later discovered abandoned on Pennywayne Road. Inside, investigators recovered a baseball bat. Forensic testing tied it directly to the attack. Davies's blood was found on its surface, while Nushi's DNA was present on the handle. It was the first solid forensic link connecting the brutal assault inside 319 Newport Road to the men suspected of organising and leading the response. For South Wales Police, the recovery of the Mazda marked a decisive breakthrough in the case. Inside 319 Newport Road, blood traces matched both Fager and Carl Davies, confirming the violent struggle that had unfolded there. A distinctive hoodie belonging to Waga was recovered from the scene, stained and discarded, tying him irrevocably to the break-in. Elsewhere, cell site analysis mapped the movement of phones linked to the suspects, showing devices that had suddenly gone dark after the killing. A tactic prosecutors later said was an attempt to defeat justice. As weeks passed, Crime Stoppers launched major public appeals. Rewards of £5,000 each were offered for information leading to the arrests of Joseph Nushi, Mihal Dahana, and Gladys Mehala. Later, as the investigation widened, the reward increased to £10,000, focusing on the missing Mercedes and fugitives Artan Pellucci and Elidon Alesi. Both men had ties to Albania, fueling suspicions that the network had helped them flee the UK. Heisland Aliaj was among the first to be arrested. He was later charged with playing a direct role in guarding the cannabis crop and assisting those who attacked Waga. International cooperation became central. Nushi and Jana were arrested in Paris and extradited to face trial. Mihala was detained in Albania and returned to the UK in early 2022. Others were tracked across Germany and Albania, each extradition requiring careful coordination between South Wales Police, the National Crime Agency, and overseas forces. By late 2022, even Elidon Alesi, once thought beyond reach, had been charged in connection with the killing. The manhunt had spanned borders, involved rewards, appeals, and countless hours of analysis. Piece by piece, the net tightened around those who had responded to the raid. But what remained was the courtroom, where every detail, from DNA to phone data, would be laid bare. The case eventually came, before a Crown Court jury, where months of investigation were laid out in meticulous detail. The jury considered all the evidence we discussed earlier, and the verdicts were decisive. Joseph Nushi, identified as one of the ringleaders of the attack, was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years before parole can even be considered. Mihal Dana also received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. Heisland Aliaj was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years. Others faced different outcomes. Mario Carto and Gladys Mehala were both acquitted, walking free after jurors found the case against them insufficient. But the story did not end there. Further charges were prepared against Elidon Elezi, Artem Pelucci, and Legend Cavani, each accused of roles within the wider network, and some still subject to extradition and international warrants. In the early hours of Saturday, the 4th of December 2021, Kent police were called to a disturbance on Cayley Road in Tunbridge Wells. It was around 3:15 a.m. when neighbours heard noise spilling from a terraced house and alerted the authorities. When patrols arrived, the first thing they saw was the trail. Cannabis plants ripped out and scattered along the pavement, leading straight to the front door. Inside, officers would uncover the scale of what had been operating there. A fully functioning cannabis grow house. The building was part of a pattern increasingly familiar to police across the southeast. Ordinary residential properties repurposed by organized crime groups into hidden cannabis factories. Living inside the house was Shovan Pipaj, a 25-year-old from Albania who had been drawn into the criminal world of cannabis production. Known in police files as a gardener, his job was not just tending plants but staying on site, a deterrent to opportunistic raiders. For Pipaj, the risks were as much from rivals as from the police. He had already crossed paths with the law. Back in 2018, he was jailed for 2 years and 3 months after being caught running another cannabis farm in Northfleet, Kent, alongside Salvatore Cola. Despite that conviction, he returned to the same world. By December 2021, Pipaj was living locally in Tunbridge Wells and embedded once again in the cultivation trade. His role made him the immediate target when an outside group decided the grow was worth stealing. That night, a crew travelled down from Essex, moving in 3 cars. They weren't coming to buy or negotiate. Their aim was to strip the crop and claim its value for themselves. Kieran Stewart, 20, from Hornchurch, Essex, was seen as one of the leaders. Already entangled in serious crime, he was known for his willingness to use violence and had a reputation for carrying blades. With him was Kelvin Amoako, just 18, from Ilford in East London. Despite his age, he was deeply involved in the robbery crew. In the chaos of that night, his name would later be tied to some of the most serious acts of violence inside the house. Another of the group was Bartosz Malowski, 28, from Croydon. Older than many of the others, he was physically imposing and regarded as one of the muscle figures. Nathan Rainforth, 22, from Pilgrim's Hatch in Essex, also made the journey. Like others, he was armed and ready to strip the grow house of its crop. So too was Dante Simpson Palmer, 19, from South London. Barely out of his teens, he was another of the gang's younger faces, but one prepared to take part in the violence. Supporting them were others who played roles in organising transport and logistics. Charles Riley, 28, from Essex, and Mohammed Maya, 26, from Romford, were tied to the planning side, part of the network that brought the group together for the raid. In total, 13 men were involved in the plot. Some entered the house, some waited outside, others provided support. But all had one goal: to seize the cannabis crop and leave with a haul worth tens of thousands of pounds. But this time, the robbery would not go to plan. Within the walls of Cayley Road, a confrontation was about to erupt that would end with a man dead and 13 others facing trial for their roles in his killing. When the gang stormed into Cayley Road, the violence erupted quickly. Neighbours later described hearing shouting, crashes, and the sounds of a struggle breaking out inside. From the outside, the first sign was the smashed window, a point of entry where the crew forced themselves in. Inside the house bore the scars of the fight, overturned furniture, blood traces, and cannabis plants torn from their pots. The property had been fortified. At the stairwell, officers would later find a metal gate running floor to ceiling, a deliberate barrier to delay both rival gangs and the police. It meant that once Pepage was trapped upstairs, there was no escape route. He was cornered by the raiders and subjected to a brutal, sustained attack. The post-mortem findings later revealed how Pepage was stabbed in the chest, the wound puncturing his heart. He died from hemopericardium, his chest cavity filling with blood. Multiple other injuries confirmed the ferocity of the assault. Investigators also recovered a blood-stained knife from the scene, evidence of the weapon used to inflict the fatal blow. Inside, the scale of the violence was recorded in a way the jury would later hear for themselves. Tyaron Stewart dialed 999 mid-attack, claiming he feared for his own life. On that same recording, however, prosecutors said his voice could be heard shouting to Kelvin Amoako, urging him to stab Pepage. That instruction, caught on tape, captured the intent of the raiders more clearly than any later statement could. Pepage, prosecutors told the court, stood no chance. Beaten and stabbed repeatedly, he was overwhelmed by the gang. While he lay dying upstairs, some of the men turned to their phones, filming themselves as they carried cannabis plants out of the house. They laughed, joked, and bragged about the raid, showing off their haul even as their victim's life ebbed away inside. By the time police and fire crews forced their way through the heavy security gate, Pepage was beyond saving. The gang had already scattered into the night, carrying their stolen crop, leaving behind only a bloodied crime scene and the body of the man who had tried to guard it. The scale of the killing meant the inquiry was handed to the Kent and Essex Serious Crime Directorate, the specialist unit responsible for dismantling organised criminal networks. Detectives quickly pieced together that this was not a single act of violence, but the fallout of a planned robbery involving a large crew. In the hours after the attack, the focus was on containment. Within the first 24 hours, police had already made 5 arrests, including a 17-year-old boy, 2 18-year-olds, a 28-year-old man, and a 33-year-old woman suspected of assisting offenders. Each was linked back to Essex, highlighting where the raiders had travelled from. As the inquiry widened, more names surfaced. Through surveillance, phone records, and public appeals, detectives traced the wider group. By the end of the operation, 13 men had been identified and arrested, each tied to the robbery in some form. The evidence was layered. CCTV footage captured the convoys of cars travelling into Tunbridge Wells and leaving the scene. Phone records revealed bursts of communication before the raid and sudden silences after the killing. Even more damning were the self-shot videos that we have already discussed. For detectives, the investigation was relentless but systematic. Piece by piece, each suspect was tracked, arrested, and confronted with the growing body of evidence. What began as a chaotic 999 call within weeks became one of the most comprehensive organised crime prosecutions Kent police had ever brought to court. The scale of the Tunbridge Wells case was unlike anything local courts had seen in years. With 13 defendants facing accusations of murder, manslaughter, and conspiracy to rob, the weight of the proceedings forced prosecutors to split the case into 2 separate trials. Together, they exposed the full picture of how greed, violence, and chaos had converged on Cayley Road on that December night. The first trial, held in Loughborough, and later sentencing at the Old Bailey in May 2023, focused on the central figures. Prosecutors outlined how the raid spiraled into a fatal confrontation, with the jury hearing chilling evidence that we have already covered. Kieran Stewart and Kelvin Amoako, together with Bartosz Malowski, were convicted of murder. Stewart, already guilty of conspiracy to rob, was handed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years. Amoako and Malowski also received life sentences, each with a minimum of 22 years. Malowski, aged 28, received the same life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years, before parole could even be considered. Not all of those in the first trial were convicted of murder. Nathan Rainforth was cleared of the charge, but found guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob, receiving a prison term of 7.5 years. Dante Simpson Palmer faced the same charges and was sentenced to 6 years. Charles Riley and Mohammed Maya, both tied to the robbery but not the killing, were convicted of conspiracy to rob. Riley was jailed for 10 years, while Maya received 6.5. The second trial followed in October 2023 at Lewis and later Hove Crown Court, where the remaining defendants were brought before the judge. Ray Render, who admitted manslaughter and conspiracy to rob, was sentenced to 6 years. Jonathan Hedges was convicted of conspiracy to rob and jailed for 2 years and 6 months, while Nathan Turner was also convicted of conspiracy to rob and possession of cannabis with intent to supply, receiving 6 years. Alongside them, Zach Cutting and Glenn Ho were both found guilty of conspiracy to rob. Fabian Susmuller, also convicted of conspiracy, was handed 2 years and 6 months, with an additional conviction for perverting the course of justice after passing a note to another defendant during trial. By the end of October 2023, every one of the 13 men tied to the Tunbridge Wells raid had been convicted. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.